to tell you about my story, I want to preface the fact that I'm not about to tell you this, this huge crazy story about how I was pulled over by the police and, pulled out of my car and thrown onto the hood of my car. I wasn't frisked or anything, or shouted the N-word at or anything like that. And, my story is going to sound a little bit, less extreme in that manner. But I think in me sharing that, I think it's also helping to recognize that those are one form, or that's one way of exerting discrimination and oppression and racism, and that other ways of expressing discrimination and oppression are still relevant, and they're still just as not okay. They're all equally as not okay. I mean, no, it's not, me being brutalized by the police or anything like that. Obviously, that's, worse, but it doesn't make it any more okay because it didn't happen in that way. And so I grew up pretty protected. My parents grew up in New York City. When we were born, they moved us out into the Poconos fairly early. And they did that so that we wouldn't have to experience a lot of the things that they experienced, being frisked by the police or being assaulted by police or being criminalized or dehumanized or anything like that. I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood. I went to predominantly white schools. More often than not, I was one of 2 black students in a classroom. I was, maybe one of 6 black students in a whole grade, and in a grade that probably had easily 70 to 100 kids. And so a lot of what I experienced were less overt versions of discrimination or oppression or racism, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a second. But my first experience with the police would have been the first time that I really recognized what it meant to be black in America, for that matter. I had to have been anywhere between 8 and 10, maybe even 11. I don't think I was in middle school yet. It had to have been Black Friday. I was with my brother and my 2 male cousins, and then my female cousin, and then her mother, who was also my cousin, and my aunt. And so we were shopping in a Walmart and at the Garden State Mall in New Jersey on Black Friday, and we were walking through the aisles, and 2 police officers comes over and stops us. And they, in some way, rather, they had asked us if we could turn out our pockets. And so my aunt and my cousin immediately said, "What's going on? Why do they need to do that?" And they responded by saying that there had been a report that a group of black kids had stolen some stuff. That was all that really mattered at that point, was that we were a group of kids and we were black. Didn't matter how old we were, how tall we were, what we were wearing, any of that. We were black and we were in a group. That was enough for them. So we did what we were told. We turned out our pockets, and they only found, maybe some candy, probably a penny or a quarter that we found in the sofa that day, maybe a couple of dollars that our parents gave us, maybe the Game Boy system that we came there with. And they responded with, "Okay, thank you," and left. My aunt and my cousin turned to us all and they said, "This is what it's like to be black in America. This is what you can expect going forward from now on. That you will be looked at as though you are a criminal. If something happens or something goes wrong, you'll most likely be the first one looked at. And you're to follow what the officer says so that you don't get hurt or that, you don't get arrested or anything like that." And that had been the first time that I recognized that just because of the color of my skin, that people would look at me as though I was a criminal. So beyond that experience, like I said, a lot of what I experienced growing up came in the form of microaggressions. And if you don't know, microaggressions are essentially backwards compliments. They're little invalidations that don't come across, or they are not intended to be insults or negative for that matter. But what they essentially come out to is kind of like a paper cut. And if you ever had a paper cut, you know that you don't recognize them right away, or at least not all the time. You recognize them much later on, and then they sting. They sting a lot. And so that's essentially what a microaggression is. It's something that it's kind of like this backwards compliment. It comes out, or it's felt as though it's an insult, and you don't really recognize it right away, but then much later on you start to realize, what kind of impact it had on you. So microaggressions are a bunch of little cuts that eventually start to add up into this one huge wound, and they don't really heal the same way. And so they come in the form of, where are you really from? Or, you're a credit to your race, or you run really fast for a girl. And so that's a lot of what I experienced. Being the only, sometimes the only black kid in the class, or one of two, or the only black kid in most circles. A lot of the microaggressions that I heard came in the form of, you're like an Oreo, or you just went black, or you're so black, or you're one of the good ones, or even you don't act black. So all statements that people didn't really intend to be negative or come off as an insult, but they kind of do. And so I didn't really realize what they were when I first had heard them, being young and being naive, not really understanding a lot of those things. But what I later came to find out is that I started internalizing a lot of these messages, recognizing that it wasn't really okay to be black, because this is what it meant to be black. If I wore baggy pants, or I wore things in a certain style, that made me so black. That was something that black people did, and it wasn't the norm. If I was sassy, or I talked with my hands, or I clapped my hands when I spoke, or I moved my head, or nodded, or moved my neck when I spoke, or I was sassy of any kind, that's what was associated with being black, and that wasn't okay. Or it was something that was comedic in some senses. And recognizing that to be black, I had to be these representations. I wasn't Chris Rock. I wasn't Chris Tucker. I wasn't a comedian. I wasn't trying to be funny. I wasn't trying to be anything but who I was, and that was noted as being an outsider. That was noted as being black at times. Other times when I wasn't doing those things, that's when I was part of the majority. That's when I was part of white culture, the dominant culture. So recognizing and almost essentially pulling me out of my own culture, I internalized a lot of those messages, thinking that, how can I be black but also act this way? If I don't act in that way, am I really black? Am I shunning my own culture because I don't act this way? And doing those things are going to get me in more trouble sometimes. And so, is that okay? How do I make sense of that? And so it took a lot of time for me to be able to accept who I was as a black man. Later on, around the time when I was learning to drive, so about 14, 15, 16, the case and murder of Trayvon Martin had come out. And I remember it being all over the news, and I remember being pulled upstairs to my parents' room by my dad, and him sitting both me and my brother down and talking to us about what this case was about and what had happened, and that this is essentially what it's like to be black in America. And he proceeded to teach us about things that we just couldn't do while being black. And so, especially learning how to drive, we needed to know this in case we would ever be pulled over or anything like that. And so he told us that while driving, don't wear your hat. Don't wear your wave cap. Don't wear your do-rag. Don't wear any of that stuff. You make sure that you don't have anything on your head. Don't wear your hood. You know, you'll be looked at in a certain kind of way. You'll be looked at as though you're a thug. You'll be looked at as though you're a gangster of some kind, like you're selling dope on the corners. The way that you wear your hair is also going to be a way that people are going to stereotype you and associate you to being some kind of thug or gangster. So I never dyed my hair. Whenever I drive, I don't wear hats. I never grew my hair much longer than, you know, maybe 2 or 3 inches off my head. I never dreaded it, anything like that. I never braided it because I feared that it would turn me into some kind of criminal, or I would be looked at as though I was some kind of criminal. He proceeded to tell us that that when and if we ever get pulled over, to make sure that you keep your hands on the steering wheel. Don't make any sudden movements. Always be polite to the police officer. If you're ever going to do anything, make sure you ask for permission first. Because if we don't do any of those things, or even if we only do one of those things, we'll be looked at as though we're being disrespectful or that we're a danger. And that's grounds for getting arrested or even worse, killed. And so from that point on, I had always feared getting pulled over by the police. I internalized a lot of those messages for fear of my own life and for self-preservation, for that matter. And so to keep this from being a super long video or anything like that, I want to end with this as well, that colorblindness is not the goal here. You know, I think we're recognizing that people are doing and saying things within our own circles that might have sounded or might have been okay at one point, but it just isn't. Colorblindness is not the goal here. We're taught when we're growing up in school that that people shouldn't be treated differently and that we're all the same because we're all human and we're all made up of blood, organs, veins, arteries, skin, so on and so forth. And while a lot of that is true, there's parts of it that isn't necessarily true. So yes, none of us should be treated differently just because we are different. But we shouldn't not recognize that each other is different. We are different. There are differences between us as humans, and that's what makes us special. You know, it's about recognizing those differences, acknowledging those differences, and embracing those differences between us. Recognizing that, you know, I came from a different culture than you. And, you know, this is how my culture responds to things or acts with things. And that it's not any less okay than what the dominant culture might do. It's recognizing that we're different and that's okay too. Excuse me. And so not dehumanizing anybody because they are different. We're taught that America is a melting pot, and that's not really okay anymore either. We shouldn't strive to be a melting pot where we all come together to make up this one culture and abandon our own cultures. No, we should be trying to strive to be a bit more of a mosaic. You know, like all coming together as one, but each part of the mosaic stands out. Recognizing that they are different, that they have meaning, and that their culture is just as meaningful as any other person's culture. And so my hope with this is that this message gets out into other people's communities and that we're able to start having these conversations and start learning from our mistakes. What I hope people end up doing is learning that if they've ever, you know, perpetuated or exhibited or elicited some kind of microaggression, that you own it. Acknowledge the fact that you've done so and learn from it. You know, correct that mistake. When you hear other people doing it, correct that mistake. It's okay to make mistakes. We're all human. We're going to make mistakes. What's not okay is trying to cover up the fact that you made a mistake, not acknowledging that you've made a mistake, not saying anything when other people make mistakes, not learning from your mistakes. And what's especially not okay is to continue perpetuating those mistakes after you've already noticed that you've made a mistake. So that's my story. I hope everyone's able to share this message, and I hope that we can all do better and come together as humans, because it's not a political battle here. It's a human battle. So, bye.